Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session, Deploying and Managing Computer Vision Models at the Edge with Wallaroo.ai. My name is Anna. I'm an event planner for Reactor, joining you from Redmond, Washington. Before we start, I have some quick housekeeping. Please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We seek to provide a respectful environment for both our audience and presenters. While we absolutely encourage engagement in the chat, we ask that you please be mindful of your commentary, remain professional and on topic. Keep an eye on the chat also. We'll be sharing useful links and answering questions. The session is recorded. It'll be available on demand in 24 to 48 hours, which brings us to our session. I am very excited to turn it over to Steve and Martin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Awesome.
Hi,
Thank you so much
everyone.
for having us.
Thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to spend this with us, and looking forward to the rest of this session and content that we're going to go through. What we'll do first is we'll have a look at so there we go. Right, we got the deck up. So yeah, thanks again for joining us. I know there's a lot of things competing. We'll be doing in this session as we'll be going through showing the advent of the technology capabilities and so on, and companies really looking to take advantage of AI models, and not just getting them into production in the also do first is introduce ourselves. So we get a chance to find out who we are, who Wallaroo.ai is, what we do, and then we'll cover some use case scenarios. Some of you may be familiar with some of these use cases, but some of you may not. But we'll then dive into an edge specific scenario, and we'll make that, go look into some retail example. And then we'll talk about the challenges of getting into production. We've seen, Gartner studies and other studies come out where, 90% of ML production projects fail to, realize, get into production, and only 10% of those actually return, the investment back to the business. And so making that leap from experimentation and testing into production is super critical for businesses, and making sure that, the time and effort that you put in as data scientists, ML engineers and ML ops engineers is, rewarded by, getting these projects into production. And we'll actually sort of dive into that. This is a tech session, so we will go into that sort of tech demo and show you how we do that. We'll do it in the context of running it, with the Wallaroo engine, but we'll get a chance to see some of the code that takes effect, and how you actually deploy, to the edge. And we'll have an opportunity at the end for Q&A as well. You can ask questions in the queue. We've got a couple of colleagues with us. We've got John Hanserick, who's our senior technical document writer, and also Bob, who is a senior engineer, working with customers on the front line as well. And so that's essentially what we'll look to go through today. And apologies if this scared you a little bit there, but yeah, they wanted me to put up as a sort of photograph of myself and sort of introduce who I am, right? So essentially, I've been really lucky. I've been in the computer industry probably, over 2 decades, almost coming up for 3. And I've enjoyed areas like in all businesses, parts of the business, from pre-sales tech, partner development, partner marketing, IT pro evangelism, when it was called that. And also, most recently in the last 10 years, it's been, working with developer communities and folks like yourselves, from the gamut of student, higher ed, right through to seasoned professionals. And it's always impressed me, to see how, developers like yourselves and data scientists and ML engineers look at, the challenges that you have and look at, technology and apply that technology and make those solutions work, better, whether it be in an enterprise context or, improving, social context as well. And so I joined Wallaroo.ai about 18 months ago. I was with Microsoft for about 25 years before that. And so I've enjoyed both spectrums of the tech industry, from a super large company down to, a really awesome Series A startup as well. So enough of me. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Great to be here today. My name is Steve Notley, and I lead our field engineering team here at Wallaroo.ai. I've been involved in the AI space for a number of years. I started off in academia, kind of more on the theoretical side of AI, theory and algorithms and different model types. And since then, while I was in academia, I got to see how many interesting innovations that there are there, and how few of them actually make their way into, quote unquote, the real world, right? Into products, into things that really change how we go through everyday life. And so when I made the switch kind of over into industry, I really wanted to be focused on, what are those barriers to AI really making a meaningful difference, and how can we, really empower people to knock down those barriers. And so I've, really spent my whole career working on AI applications and working directly with customers on doing just that, on trying to, make those kind of ideas, those dreams a reality. And so I've done that, like Martin, at companies big and small. And so I spent the longest periods of time working on applications in the financial services space, as well as in pharmaceutical research. And now I'm lucky enough to be here at Wallaroo.ai, and working with customers really of all stripes and across all industries, some of which we'll get to hear about here today. So thank you all for having me.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Steve. And so who are Wallaroo.ai? So essentially, we are, help you get those models into production, the ones that you've spent so much time and effort through testing, through experimentation. And, like that challenge I talked about a few minutes ago of, how do we get this into production now that we have our models in place? And so that's where, Wallaroo specializes in. We are that model operations center for companies that, allow you to sort of take and, deploy serverless models. Then once they're in production, you have the task of making sure that they are optimized and that they are performing the way that, you intended them to. And so that's where we have capabilities of observability, for data drift and things like that. And then also optimizing those as well. There's other models that you might have that, are performing better, or you want to compare and contrast, using, things like A/B testing or shadow deploy. And so we have the capability for you to do that in production without having to take down that whole environment as well. And you can deploy those, wherever you want. You can deploy them to, any of the clouds that are available to you. We also have on-premises for certain situations that maybe require that, whether it's for compliance or some other reason. And then we also have the capability, as we'll go through here today, to talk about how do we deploy those models to edge scenarios and edge endpoints as well. And the other thing that's great about, what we've built into the technology is, giving you the choice of architecture with which you deploy to, whether it's x64 or, leveraging GPUs or a blend of those, or even we have capability now for Ampere ARM and taking advantage of that architecture as well. And so those are some of the things that, the product just slots into that existing environment that you have, whether you've made investments in other technologies. It's really super important to make sure that anything that you use, plugs into, what you have in place. And what's also important as well is giving you, the data scientist or ML engineer, an environment in which you're familiar and comfortable with, and not making you sort of have to go away for training or adjust your behavior. That just takes time, and that costs a lot of money, and effort to do that. And so, we have the capability of, if you're working and familiar in a UI, great, you can work in a UI. If you're familiar at the command line and working with SDKs or APIs, you've got that capability as well. And so that's just who we are. And so you'll get a chance to see that as we sort of go through the demo session again today. So Some of the things, Steve, like, do you want to walk us through some, scenarios of computer vision and the edge, and we'll give folks an idea of, where can this be applied to?
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's probably not surprising to folks today to hear. Ooh, I think we want to cut back to the slides quickly. There we go. Thank you. So it's probably not surprising for folks here today to hear that there's lots of applications to computer vision across many different industries, right? And so it was one of kind of the earliest places where AI started to really, kind of to my point earlier, make a big difference in real applications out there in everyday life. And so whether this be from things in the life sciences space, some areas that we see here are, of course, the use of AI in general in all parts of research and development, but really where we see a lot of vision in play is actually much closer to the clinic, right? Around things like diagnostic imaging, as well as some areas of automating certain parts of research, right? Certain tasks that are very time intensive. We also see, this span, many other industries such as security and retail, as we see here. And a lot of these use cases involve tracking people and objects as they move around, right? In the case of security, you're really looking for, is someone in a location that they're not supposed to be, or are they, conducting themselves in a way or have certain behaviors that suggest that they could be a danger. And then on the retail side, really interested in, okay, well, how are my people that I'm trying to bring in, my customers, how are they actually moving around a store? How are they behaving? How are they interacting with the various displays that I've set up? As well as tracking the objects themselves, right? We've all seen kind of the flashy cashierless checkout systems that are becoming more and more popular. So tracking the objects themselves as they get picked up and put off the shelves in order to track people's totals in current carts. And then, of course, we have the manufacturing side. And with the rise of Industry 4.0, this is an area where we've seen lots of data coming in from all kinds of sensors around a given factory, from things like temperature and pressure readings and more kind of IoT side data to, actual images, both of machinery and of products themselves, to do things like detect failure points, detect defects in manufacturing processes, or try to figure out ways to optimize yield. And so a wide variety of applications here on the computer vision side. And this is really only compounded when you start to think about what's possible at the edge. And the reason why people are turning to the edge really more now than they ever have is just the sheer volume of information, right? And so in all of these cases, you can imagine, okay, great, I have, one security camera and it's streaming images to, some cloud location. I'm analyzing it there and making decisions. And that might make sense when you're dealing with, one device or two devices, but the scale and pervasiveness of these applications mean that that's not really what we're dealing with. We're dealing with many security cameras, tens, hundreds, thousands around a location, maybe 10 or 100, somewhere in the 10 to 100 range of cameras for a retail location to track these. And that means that, having this centralized computation quickly becomes intractable, right? Sending all of that information back to a central location to be analyzed is definitely not realistic. It's not performant. And there's a lot of cases where there's things that make that not even, remotely possible, such as, things like air gap systems or more secure locations. And so the whole idea with the edge is, well, now how can we bring that compute, that model actually closer to where this data is being gathered, so that we can perform any actions that we need right there on that location and be more judicious about the information that we centralize. And so
it's interesting. Sorry, Steve. It's interesting that you talk about, taking all those images and then, sending them back to, the cloud or, back to the data center. And I had a project that we worked on. We went through, it was a retail project. It went through all the sort of testing and experimentation. And we had these edge devices in the retail locations, but they were sending the data through like a mobile, we had a SIM card in the edge device, and it was sending those images. And that turned out at the end of the day, like just the cost of sending, all those images across, mobile network, it ended up being cost prohibitive, regardless of how well, that was performing, and so being able to, process that data at the edge, and like you say, let's not incur that latency or that cost of, sending all this up to a central location.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's something that we absolutely see all the time. And the more devices, the more sensors that we see rolling out, that only kind of compounds the issue there. And so, really what we see at the edge is that there's really a wide variety of devices being rolled out, and a wide variety of data coming back in. But this is particularly salient in computer vision, where more information allows us to really make very informed decisions in a lot of these use cases that we have here.
There's also the compliance. There's when you in Europe, GDPR, etc. And again, we had a project where in a manufacturing plant, and we're looking to take machine data and send it out to the cloud. And so they said that no, there's some data that just doesn't leave the factory at all. And so that's something that you have to consider and work around if you don't have the capability again of processing that locally on the device at the edge.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's another key challenge of the edge, in addition to latency, is really the variety of environments that we're dealing with, right? You have no idea how much hardware you're going to have out there on edge devices, right? Or you ideally do by the time you actually get there, but depending on the applications, you could be dealing with one kind of hardware, many kinds of hardware. They could be anything from the tiniest devices that you've ever seen to things that are, pretty close to what you would expect on a fully, kind of industrial size machine. They could be different architectures. They could have GPUs available versus, varying amounts of CPUs. And so there's a lot of eventualities that you have to plan for on the hardware side, as well as, to your point, on the networking side, right? You could have limited connectivity. You could have no connectivity. We deal with customers all the time that are, as you point out, in secure sites where that's just not an option, as well as in just extremely remote sites where, it's very expensive and not really practical for, a given site to have frequent or any internet connectivity. So those are definitely some common challenges at the edge.
Yeah, definitely. And so when we look at, deploying and serving models to the edge, just before we get in, to the demo, how are people deploying today? You hear about single line of code to deploy. We talk about that ourselves, and we'll get to see that. But then, is there an element of build your own versus do I go with a company that can sort of do that sort of end-to-end production capability for me?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we see a lot of both. So I guess backing up for kind of a moment to talk about what we mean when we really say edge and when we say an edge device. You really have the place where you have centralized operations where you do maybe your model development, your data synthesis. That's maybe that's a large cluster that you have on-prem, or maybe it's an Azure cluster that you have processing a lot of this information. And then you have the device or devices where data is coming in. And then really anything that comes in between those two things could be considered an edge device, right? And so this takes a lot of different sizes and shapes. As we kind of pointed out, there's a lot of different hardware depending on whether you're treating your edge device as the actual camera itself and a small board that's actually on the camera device itself, versus, okay, well, maybe for a given store, you have a small server that sits in the back and deals with just the 50 cameras from store A, and then in your other 100 stores across the country, they also each have their own little server, and you treat that as a quote unquote edge device. So it's really a very broad term, and that broadness means that there's just so much variety in these things, and hardware, like we pointed out before, hardware, network, and connectivity, and then also the considerations around the kinds of models that you use as well. And so what that means is we do see a lot of people creating their own as well as using vendors. There's certainly plenty of both in the industry, but what we find is that really creating your own is more common among teams that are a little bit earlier in their AI journey, because as you go ahead and start to roll out your first model or two that you're ready to actually take into production, you deal with a lot of these considerations as they come up. And you work through this. You either learn the skills of the various technologies that are required yourself. So, taking a model to production and then to the edge involves doing things like, Dockerizing the container, creating a reliable environment for it to run in. If you're doing cloud production deployments, then standing up an endpoint that can be used to actually interact with your model. And then, considering edge deployment, kind of refactoring that container to keep in mind whatever hardware you're going to, really have in place at the edge, make sure that it's running optimally and of course, is running it all. And so there's lots of different technologies that go into coordinating that story kind of end to end. And so we do see people, as I said, kind of tackling these one by one, either upskilling or hiring new people as they sort of come across these various roadblocks and resolve them. But then what they find is that as they add a second model and add a third model, some of these challenges are easier the second or third time around, and some of them, are just a little bit different for all of these different kind of models, these different deployment destinations. And so at a certain point of having done this a few times, we do find people typically tend to turn more towards the vendor side. Of course, we're a little bit biased here as well, but that is really reflective of what we see in industry. And that's really just to save you all time, right? At the end of the day, doing plumbing with slight tweaks for model, 1 versus model 1000, people want to spend their time doing things that are a little bit more innovative. And if there are solutions that can give you some time back and take some of that variability out, at a certain level of scale, people find that just becomes worth it for them and for their teams.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. So we've set the stage here. We've talked about use cases and, how you apply them and optimize that environment as well, because it's not just a case of deploy and, you're done. And you got to make sure that you can observe, optimize, and, make sure that they are performing the way they're supposed to. And so, Steve, you want to quickly tee up, the demo that you're going to go through, an example? And
absolutely. Yeah. So today we're going to be looking at one of those retail use cases that we had just mentioned, and we're going to be going through this whole journey of picking up with, okay, well, I have this retail use case where I'm detecting objects. I'm using that for inventory management, right? Keeping an eye on my various shelf locations around a given store so that I can see as people come by, they purchase items get low in stock. I can keep track of both, how my shelf stock is around the store and then global stock that I have available on my location so that I can optimize things like restocking shelves as well as, reordering wholesale items. And so this is, kind of a common use case that we see here. And we're going to go through this whole journey of great, as a data scientist and in charge of solving this problem, I have this model, I've trained it, I've seen it, I am ready to go. And now I need to kind of take it through the journey that we just outlined a little bit, right? I need to go ahead and first deploy it to the cloud so that I can stand this up as a service and see, kind of what that journey looks like, test it out, go through that kind of centralized computation journey. And then extending that to now I need to package this up and send it out to all of my various edge locations, which for this example, maybe that is a server in the back of each one of these stores, doing some centralization from some of these cameras and treating kind of each one of these different stores as a quote unquote edge location. And so we're going to jump right into it and pick up midstream here and see, how I can go ahead and actually go through that deployment journey. And so we're going to be doing this using the Wallaroo platform today. And so, here picking up on that data science journey in my programming environment, in this case, I'm in a Jupyter notebook that, I may have been using to experiment earlier and actually develop this model. And I go ahead and actually import all of the packages that I need, including, all of the normal things that I would expect to work with for my model, as well as the Wallaroo SDK, which is how I'm actually going to connect to my cluster and interact with my models that I have in production.
Steve, so at the beginning, I talked about, giving folks, an environment that they're familiar with. Like, do folks have to use Jupyter notebooks? If I've got VS Code or a different IDE, am I okay to continue working on that for deployment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the first thing that I'm going to do here after I import this SDK is actually create a client back to my server. And so what that's going to do is actually, I've authenticated recently, so it didn't prompt me to authenticate here. But what that's actually going to do is connect to the place where Wallaroo is installed, which could be that, which is going to be that centralized location, right? Again, that could be on premise, that could be in Azure and in any cloud provider. And so once we connect there, we're able to manipulate that environment and deploy models as needed. And that means that this can really be done from anywhere that I have Python installed, right? So it's a normal kind of package that I pip install here and then import and then connect to this cluster. And that means, yep, Jupyter Notebook, great. VS Code, great. In that Azure ML notebook that I was developing from, fantastic. Any of those places, so long as they have connection to my central cluster here, I can use to manage and deploy my models.
Awesome.
And so once I've gone ahead and created that connection, I actually go through, the process of actually deploying this model out to production, right? And so that really comes down to these 3 lines of code using our Wallaroo SDK here. And so the first thing I'm going to do is take this ResNet model and actually upload it to Wallaroo. And so the key components here that I'm going to actually use are really just the model itself, where I can see, my full path to my model file here, and tell Wallaroo what framework I use to create this model and what my target architecture is. And so we can see here, I'm dealing with an ONNX model. And so I pointed this at framework.onyx, and I'm dealing with x86 architecture. And so I let Wallaroo know that information as well, so that Wallaroo knows anytime I'm creating a service here or packaging this up for edge deployment to include those relevant x86 libraries.
Steve, are there other model frameworks that we can use here, and are we forced to kind of use ONNX? There's data scientist teams that are building models in different formats. It'd be great for them to use what they've worked on already.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Wallaroo is extremely flexible here. And so essentially anything that you can express in Python, we're going to support, is the short answer, right? And so we have native support for a lot of framework types, including ONNX, TensorFlow, including PyTorch. And that means that we have essentially proprietary engines that are going to run super, super fast for those things. We also have support for basically all of the other really prevalent frameworks in Python, XGBoost, scikit-learn, Hugging Face, and others that we will essentially also optimize quite a bit, optimize the data transfer, reduce that overhead, and also, where possible, automatically convert to representations in more performant frameworks as well. So there's a lot that we'll do under the hood to kind of optimize here based on the framework. But setting all that aside, if you just have a piece of Python code that doesn't use any of the major frameworks that you created yourself that you want to deploy here as well, we also support framework.python, which you can go ahead and say, hey, I essentially just want to take this arbitrary Python code. Wallaroo, please go ahead and automate all of that packaging for me and treat this thing like you would any other model. So yeah, wide variety of options available at this junction here.
Awesome.
And so the first step, that takes us to really this first step, which is essentially uploading this model to that centralized location, making it available. And so the next step that I need to take here is actually, for the purposes of this cloud deployment, how much hardware do I actually want to allocate to these instances? And so I set aside a deployment config here, which contains that information. And so I tell Wallaroo, I want each instance of this, in this case, to have 1 CPU and 1 gig of memory. I also here specify a replica count, which is more pertinent for cloud deployment than edge deployment, but that's essentially how many instances of this model do I want to spin up to be able to concurrently serve requests. And so this can be a fixed number. I can set this to auto scale. But in general, I'm going to really specify my hardware profile here, including, as we see here, CPUs, and not pictured here, but I would specify GPUs available in the same way. And so in the cloud, this is going to be really my full deployment configuration. At the edge, this will serve as essentially a default configuration that I can also override at runtime on the edge. But we find a lot of people using this to essentially test out their hardware that they expect will be available in their edge environment as well. So once I go ahead and define that, the last step to actually getting into production and deploying this is essentially combining those two previous ingredients, right? So I go ahead and say, hey, I want to stand up this pipeline. I'm going to give it a name. I want to add that model as a step to the pipeline. In Wallaroo, you can have multiple model steps that sort of feed into one another. But for this example, we're going to just use the one. And then I'm going to deploy it. I call .deploy on my pipeline and say, hey, I want to deploy it using this particular deployment configuration. And this will take about 45 seconds to go ahead and get into production. And what this is doing is actually under the hood doing all those operations that we talked about, right? It's taking the model, it's either assigning it the proper native runtime engine or converting the model to the most performant form as possible. It's going to essentially stand up the containers that are necessary for these things to run. It's going to pull all of those libraries based on the hardware architecture that I told Wallaroo to optimize for, and it's going to stand up a service and an endpoint that corresponds that I can go ahead and interact with. And so after a few seconds here, we can see that it completed. And at this point, we are in production as far as a cloud or on-prem environment is concerned. All of those things have been done. I have a model that I can access now. And so the next step here is to go ahead and test it out on one of these images that we have. So we load in a given image, and we can go ahead and call .infer with our pipeline to actually send this data point to my pipeline, have it process those inference results, and return this back. And of course, this is done here with the SDK, so I can see my inputs back and then my various output bounding boxes, classes, and confidence that are output here in raw format. And I can go ahead and visualize those just to kind of see those results and validate that they're what I expect on top of the real life image here. And now, as I said, I quickly called that with the SDK just to check it out. But of course, as you're deploying this production service, you want it to be available, generalizable, and in a format that you can integrate with anything. And so every deployment in Wallaroo also, as I said, kind of stands up that endpoint that you can hit. And so by calling pipeline.url, I then get this production endpoint that I can use to send data, send requests to, and get these inference results back. And so this is my essentially key to say, we're in business, we're in production. I'm ready to go back and deploy with more hardware if I want to scale this up. And then I can get started integrating this into any of my other services or applications as needed. And now at this point, as I said, if my target is the cloud or is on-prem, I am done. I have a model that is here in production and I'm in business. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking before about all of the challenges that come with extending this to the edge. And so we want to kind of complete this journey and say, great, in this application, I've stood up this centralized endpoint, but now, that was okay for one store, but now I've, gone out and franchised, and now I have 100 stores, and I have way more, data than I can possibly send to this centralized location. What do I do now? The answer is move to this edge architecture that we were talking about, where each store is responsible for its own compute that is done on site, and you basically just furnish those insights that you get from the data to that central location rather than all of the raw data itself. And so continuing the example here and using Wallaroo, making that leap from cloud production to the edge is really just one additional line of code here. So we take that pipeline and we go ahead and do what's called a publish on it. What this is going to do is it's going to take my pipeline, it's going to package it up in a proprietary format. It's going to also package up the Wallaroo execution engine associated for it and optimize for this. And it's going to go ahead and put both of those in a container registry that I've configured my Wallaroo instance to go ahead and point at. And so that's going to then output here for me here, all of the relevant locations for my materials to go ahead and deploy this out on the edge. And so you can see here, I have a URL for my engine. I have a URL for my pipeline itself. And so if I'm using Docker, those are the two kind of key ingredients that I need. If I have Kubernetes and Helm installed on my end edge devices, we also have a Helm chart that we can use as well. And so at this point, I have this packaged up, and you know, as the data scientist, you know, I have made this available and ready for edge deployment. And so switching hats a little bit, now I can pick up on the other side of that fence, right? And say, great, now I need to go ahead and actually roll these things out onto my various edge devices. And so I have here a couple of terminals open to kind of represent, you know, great, now I've SSH'd into one of these end devices, in this case, you know, probably for a given store, and I'm ready to go ahead and start this service and start my applications that I want to rely on this. And so essentially, I've taken the outputs from that publish and I have it kind of preloaded here. But essentially, this is just a Docker run command at its core. It takes a few environment variables, such as the information to authenticate to that container registry, and the URLs for my pipeline and my engine that were the output of that last command. And if I go ahead and run this, it will ultimately pull that Docker image down, start that service up, and now I have my pipeline and execution engine running on my edge device. And now this can be fully independent from my Wallaroo, my kind of mothership, right? My centralized location. In a separate session, we might talk about how you can also connect and manage all of these things. Shameless plug for an unnamed future session. But for now, we can kind of treat these things also as completely autonomous, right? I have this fleet that I can manage, or I can say, great, now I'm ready to cut the cord to my internet connection and have this be up and running all on its own. And so now that that service is there and running, you know, I will likely have some kind of governing application on the edge device that actually goes ahead, makes use of this deployed model, and does some sort of computation based off of the results here. So in the case of our inventory tracking example, that might be something that, you know, it continually monitors and refreshes the counts of various products in various locations around the store so that I can see how those numbers fluctuate and potentially trigger some sort of alert if an item gets below a certain threshold or something like that. And so, you know, that would be kind of a separate application that I have to drive this process. And so just to sort of, you know, kind of mock up the relationship between that application and my kind of deployed pipeline here that's running, I can go ahead and just do a simple curl to send, you know, a single frame here from my system and get my inference results back. And so I can see here that I get a very full terminal page, but if you squint and look very closely, you'll be able to see that the results here are exactly the same as the ones that we got when we were testing this out in the cloud. So I have received this inference result back from my edge deployed system. And I'm now ready to, you know, I kind of have done my hello world test here, and I'm ready to architect this larger application, which takes frames from my various cameras, runs them right there at the edge, and then does whatever I need to with the results. And so at this point, if we want to jump back to the slide where we left off on, we can sort of recap what we've gone through here. But essentially, we've gone through this full journey from starting off with this saved model and used our Wallaroo SDK to you know, go ahead and make that leap from saved model to cloud deployment, testing those out. And then, you know, finally sending this out to our edge location. And so I think we have a couple slides left if we want to jump back to those.
Yep, there we go. So I was trying to get it to work, which wasn't responding. So thanks a lot, Steve. Fantastic. So great to see that, you know, taking a model that, you know, folks have worked and spent a lot of time on, and been able to get that into production and then distribute that out to a number of edge endpoints as well. And so one of the things that, you know, before we get into Q&A, one of the things that, you know, Steve showed there is available for yourself. You can actually try this as well as a number of other models in, you know, production environment for free. We just made available on the Azure Marketplace. We have 9 free VMs for, you know, common use cases. So we actually have a couple of, you know, LLM models there. So we have Llama, and we also have Hugging Face Summarizer. And so you can deploy those into production, start inferencing those and get a feel for them as well. And then we also have, if you don't want to go that route, we also have a free community edition. The license doesn't expire. And there's no catch or anything with these. It's really for the community to help you, get hands-on and figure out, how do I learn and get, my models into production. And so the community edition, has that flexibility, and we just made it available to, deploy to GitHub Codespaces. And so you get a free quota every month with GitHub Codespaces, so you can deploy into that environment as well and get some hands-on. I talked about our senior technical document writer, John Hanzarek, who is helping out on the Q&A. And he's got some amazing tutorials and workshops and etc. On docs.wallaroo.ai that you can go and start, that learning journey as well. And then, if you are working for a company, we'd love to hear from you. If you want to find out more and get sort of free consultation, we have, Steve and his team can come in and help you, over those obstacles and hurdles. So I'll stop there. If there are any questions or things that we can answer or help folks, we can go back to, the demo itself and talk about, some of the things that Steve went through. Is there Anna, or is there anything on the queue? No questions at the moment. Okay. As Anna said, we are recording this, so it will be available. If you want to reach out to us, we have a couple of emails that you can access us through. We have community@wallaroo.ai, or you can email me direct. So martin.bald@wallaroo.ai. And I'd love to hear from you. And, again, we're a Series A startup. There's things we do right. There's things that we need to improve and work on. And so, we'd love to hear back from the community. And that's the great thing about communities. We help each other and figure some of these things out. So if there's nothing in the queue, I don't know if that means that we did a great job or we need to improve. But, let us know how we can do better. Because, what Steve talked about there is, we've deployed this example into production. And then what we're looking to do in future sessions is then, get into observability and monitoring and optimizing those models, as well as, model orchestration as well. You have multiple models, whether they're batch or real-time inferencing. It's really important to make sure that, you can manage these multitudes of models that you have in your environment, whether they're on the edge or whether they're just running, in your local data center as well. So we'll tee up those future sessions as well for you. And again, finally, thank you very much for your time. We do really appreciate it. I know your time is super valuable, and thanks for spending it today with us. Thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye-bye.